Thank you for coming to this talk. Hopefully, I think I see some of you from my JMS2 talk from yesterday. This is an interesting talk. one of my older talks, but actually a talk that I really like. This talk is basically about how to use Java E7 as an effective backend for JavaScript HTML5 rich clients. Typically, the UI solution in server-side Java and Java E specifically is server-side. It's a server. You have server-side UIs like JSF. This is sort of an alternative way of putting together a Java E7 application where you have a JavaScript HTML5 solution as a front-end UI framework, and then still using Java E7 for the rest of the stack. All right, so this is sort of my game plan for the next 50 minutes or so, and I do hope I have 50 minutes. The first 10 or 15 minutes of this talk or so, I'll actually be covering a little bit of broadly about the JavaScript HTML5 rich client landscape. The reason I do this is because when I go and talk and listen to people talk about HTML5 rich clients, often they're talking about their own little specific framework, or they're really hyped up about sort of this entire JavaScript HTML5 landscape, and maybe that's an attribute of this particular technology. But they never actually sort of step back and take a more holistic view of, well, how does this landscape really look like, especially in historical context, as well as the context of other things that are available to solve the same problem. So I think it's valuable for me to spend a little bit of time talking about that. And then I'll be talking about the relevance of Java E7 in particular in utilizing this sort of front-end technology. And actually the bulk of this talk is going to be very, very code-oriented. I'll be spending a lot of time showing you code on how to put together this sort of architecture in particular. In fact, one of the artifacts that I hope to enable you with is actually an example application doing just that, sort of as a starting point for you to explore this sort of architecture going forward. All right, so we'll start with the basics. What is going on with this HTML5 rich client landscape? So I think most of us that have been in this industry for a while know that this is a pretty old debate. This is a debate that has gone on since the beginning of time as far as Java is concerned. And in fact, as far as computing is concerned. In the very old days, in the mainframe days, where we really started was very, very thin clients. So those clients were very, very simplistic. All they really would do is text input and output, maybe some text colors, and that's really it, and that's your UI. So very, very lightweight sort of processing power involved there, and pretty much all of the processing power, including UI logic, rendering logic, persistence, everything else, really was in these big iron mainframes sitting in front of these literally called dumb clients or thin clients. In the 80s or so, we made sort of a 180-degree reversal of that trend. The main empowering factor there being the introduction of the personal computer. Suddenly you had a lot of computing power available to you at the client. So as a result, at that time period, we saw things like Visual Basic. Hopefully, maybe some of you are familiar with this technology called Power Builder. So very, very sort of rich, complex UIs sitting on these edge desktop machines. And in this early part of this era, you actually didn't have a middleware server whatsoever. It was really just these very, very powerful applications, desktop applications, talking directly to the database. Towards the latter part of this era, you began to see things like a hybrid solution, the so-called client-server or three-tier architecture. And in that particular case, what you would have is still these heavy desktop applications, some kind of middleware solution, whether it's in that particular era written in J2E or something like COM or BCOM, and then the database. Now, the nice thing of that era was sort of unprecedented still in terms of the richness of the user experience. So the user experience was very, very good because of the fact that you had a lot of computing power and a lot of rendering power available to you native to the operating system. The big drawback of that era really was around software maintenance, right? So because of the fact that you had this software literally sitting on the client machine, installed on the client machine, each time you needed to do an upgrade, well, guess what? Now you have to go to all of these individual client machines and upgrade each one of those. So largely as a result of that, as well as the introduction of the internet, we saw another sort of 180-degree flip back to pretty much where we were with mainframes. Right? So suddenly what you have now, and we're still living in this era by and large, is very much the web application era. Right? So you would have essentially web applications that render their UI on the browser, very similar to really the dumb clients of the mainframe era, right? And really not very powerful clients. All they really do is render some UIs. The only difference being not in text, but some kind of UI, graphical UI. And basically the mainframes being replaced by Unix server clusters, largely with something like a Java EE of today or .NET of today. Now, towards the end of this, not the end of this era, but towards sort of the early 2000s or so, some of you, at least I hope, came across this little buzzword called Ajax. Okay? And the promise there was, well, why not use the browser as a rich UI framework? Right? So the idea was the browser does have all these capabilities. It can function as sort of a pseudo desktop UI framework. So let's use it in that way, using sort of the HTTP request at that point in time, essentially REST requests to the backend, and at that point in time using XML as sort of the glue, the data access format between the client and the server. And the big promise there was that we'll stop doing the server-side UI stuff, right? So we'll stop doing things like JSF and structs and Spring MVC, and suddenly we'll write all of our code in something like jQuery or Dojo or what have you. In reality, though, Ajax didn't really do that, right? So we don't. If you look at websites today, they're not all written in Dojo and jQuery. What has actually happened as a result of Ajax is essentially these server-side web frameworks absorbed Ajax techniques within them, right? So if you're dealing with, let's say, JSF today, you're probably dealing with a component framework that does the Ajax part under the hood for you, so something like prime faces or rich faces or ADF faces. To you, the Ajax portion is by and large just plumbing, right? Very similar idea in things like GWT and Vaadin, right? So again, these are largely server-side frameworks. You write your code and deploy it to the server side. The server-side framework then generates behind the scenes some Ajax code to give you the Ajax bits of functionality. But by and large, still these are very much in the server-side Java ecosystem space. Now, of course, we're seeing, if you will, Ajax 2.0, right? We're seeing those same kind of promises being made that were made before, made again, right? So now we're again listening to the same sort of, if you will, pitch that okay, we're going to write everything in JavaScript and everything on the browser. There wouldn't be a server-side web framework, and really the server-side just becomes a backend. So the question you should ask yourself is, why is it the case? What has changed since Ajax and now that we're suddenly doing that? So there are some legitimate reasons why this is the case. And these are sort of the principal drivers why we're talking about these things now. First and foremost is actually quite fundamentally important, and that is the improvement in the JavaScript engines themselves. Okay, for those of you who actually did try Ajax in the Ajax era, the big pragmatic problem was, the browsers of that era really weren't very good at memory collection or in even runtime performance of the JavaScript engine. So that was a big hurdle, and that fortunately has improved. It hasn't gone away, right? It's very hard to make the case that JavaScript engines on the browser are on par with a compiled type-safe language. like Java or Java or C#. However, they have improved significantly thanks to projects like V8 for the Chrome browser, as well as the SpiderMonkey projects for Mozilla, as well as Firefox, and to be fair, also in terms of IE, although IE's performance is not necessarily as good as V8 and the StarMonkey projects. The other big problem if you actually did try to do Ajax, just pure Ajax, is something called jQuery soup, and that is basically you would wind up with sort of the same era that maybe some of you have experienced with JSP, classical JSP, or classical ASP, or perhaps things like PHP even today. So what that is a lot of sort of spaghetti code, right, all over the place, JavaScript code doing all kinds of crazy stuff. The other big problem was in doing Ajax was browser compatibility issues. Right? So basically, whenever you try to do anything too sophisticated, like DOM manipulation in particular, you always have to worry about, okay, is it going to work for this browser? And then you'll wind up with these crazy if-then-else statements, doing a whole time to handle a bunch of edge cases. So that situation has improved by and large through tooling. Right? So now we have things like jQuery. jQuery doesn't make the browser compatibility problems disappear, but it's a nice facade that kind of hides at least some of the browser compatibility issues. You can think about it as a compatibility layer for browsers. Similarly, in terms of code organization, you now have the so-called MV star frameworks. Right? So things like AngularJS or React.js or Knockout. And what these are doing is that it's bringing sort of the structure that we're used to in server-side Java into the JavaScript space. So suddenly you can you can have well-organized code as opposed to having sort of spaghetti code in JavaScript. And fundamentally, the browser tools also have improved. So I don't know how many of you take this for granted, but you shouldn't take for granted things like performance profilers or debugging tools that you have in a language like Java. So it used to be that the browsers didn't have any such counterpart. So at best, if you're very lucky, you'll get a little console showing you, hey, this is a problem that occurred for you. So again, that has improved significantly as well. Now, if you look at sort of the developer tab in a browser like Chrome, it does have some of those capabilities. It has some debugging capabilities, some profiling capabilities, and again, the ecosystem also has evolved to bring some of that tooling in. So, for example, Jasmine is a good example. Unit testing for JavaScript code. And finally, most interestingly, maybe for me and also for you, is that the tool set, the basic tool set, the basic API that the browser supports is also improving because the web standards are also moving forward. So you have advancements in things like CSS, advancements in the basic markup language in HTML5, protocols like WebSocket, which we'll talk about in a second, that gives you a bit more power in dealing with how does the client and the server interact with each other, and also upcoming things like more advancements in JSON, which is basically the binary wire format for JavaScript. More language enhancements in JavaScript itself, things like HTML5 HTML components. You may not be aware of that. Basically, it's taking the idea of that we have in server-side Java, in JSF in particular, namely being able to write reusable components and applying those concepts on the browser as well. So these are all fundamental reasons why you can, in fact, think of the browser and JavaScript as a first-class language, capable of doing the things that maybe we were used to doing in things like Visual Basic and Power Builder and the like. Okay. So the question really is, there's a lot of people that are, should you believe the hype? Should you believe that we should stop doing, we should throw away all of these server-side web frameworks and, really just writing vanilla JavaScript on the browser is the way to go? I don't think so. Right? And there's a few reasons why I don't think so. I'll share with you what those are, and I'll tell you what I think. In fact, fact, really is the future in the near and long term. So clearly, these JavaScript-rich clients are good for certain things, and we know this because we've seen the JavaScript, this rich client concept for a little while now, right? Although the idea of writing this in pure JavaScript is new, in fact, we've had rich clients for a little while. So for Java developers, we've dealt with applets in the past. You know how applets work. Some of you may have worked with Flash or Flex, okay, and other similar technologies. So we know what the sweet spot of these rich clients are. Largely, rich clients are very good at writing highly dynamic, interactive interfaces, very, very compact, complex, feature-rich UIs. So to use a buzzword, things like single-page applications. So again, the same sort of problem domain that we were trying to solve with applets. So let's sort of use some concrete examples to understand what these are. So one class of applications is actually visualizing your typical desktop application. So let's say Microsoft Word or Microsoft Excel or your graphics editor, let's say GIMP or Photoshop. If you can imagine, using that same type of application on the browser natively, again, a logical technology to implement that would be these JavaScript HTML5 rich clients. Okay, it makes perfect sense. These are complex, feature-rich, dense UIs, right? And they're highly dynamic. You don't flip through multiple views. It's just one view that changes as you produce input and output as you interact with the server. Another good example is your typical mobile application. Okay, again, these are relatively compact UIs, complex. They don't have a lot of screens. It's usually you're dealing with just different visualizations of the same screen. These are again good candidates for HTML5 rich clients. However, that is not the reality for most of us. Okay, so if you look at the typical server-side application, that's not really how your typical server-side application looks like. Your typical server-side application actually looks a lot like the yesteryear's mainframe dump terminal. Okay? So what is that? These are in fact things that are relatively simple if you look at on a screen-by-screen basis. None of these screens are really all that complex. The complexity comes in terms of how you organize these screens together in flows and how you organize a workflow around them. How do you transition from one screen to the other, and what is the workflow around that? So clearly, that is not the single-page application paradigm. That is really more like, again, the mainframe dump terminal paradigm, or the web page or website paradigm. That's really the mental model of these applications. So for these sort of applications, JavaScript-rich clients are actually going to be in the way because they're going to want to enforce the single-page application paradigm on you, whereas that is not a natural fit for the application. Whereas because of their origins in web page development, server-side frameworks are actually a natural fit, for that model. Similarly, there are some particular strong points for server-side UI frameworks. They give you things like deterministic performance, and so you don't have to worry about what is running what is the capabilities on the client, how many other applications is a client running. Largely, you can control performance because you have a very simple UI that doesn't have very many demands on either CPU or memory, and by and large, you can control the amount of performance that you need by controlling the capacity on your server side. Also, things like reliability. And these are more reliable applications because they do not have very many UI requirements. They're more secure because there's not a lot going on the client. Most of the code is written on the server. Things like SEO and search engine optimization and accessibility is boring, but in reality for most enterprise applications, these are often hard requirements. And the JavaScript HTML5 ecosystem is gradually trying to catch up in terms of providing those features, but they're not there yet. They're relatively immature, whereas the server-side frameworks are actually relatively mature and have solved these problems for a while now. And let's face it, the reality is that it's hard to compare a type-safe object-oriented language like Java and something like JavaScript and HTML5. These are not truly in hardcore engineering-oriented languages. These are essentially, they have their roots in web development and the like. So they're not necessarily all that easy to develop with, especially for the developer with the average skill set, right? Obviously, you can get specialists that can deal with JavaScript and write HTML, but you need a skill set probably relatively disconnected and very different from the rest of your enterprise development stack, which is probably going to be in something like a compiled typeset language in Java. Finally, I'll make the point that server-side frameworks are actually a surprisingly strong incumbent. I didn't have this line in this deck before, but I've added this line because of an observation that I've made as I do this talk, and I've done this talk for quite some time now. So let me let me tell you what this is, right? So in order to explain this to you, I'm going to have to do a quick poll. So this is a sort of a thought exercise. I want you to think about the answer that you're going to give me, and I want you to be honest. Like, if you're not honest with yourself, this is no good, right? Most of you here are probably have some kind of server-side Java framework background. How many of you are really that enthused to abandon that wholesale? So imagine after you exit this room, you are no longer allowed to use any of that. Your only tool set is going to be just writing JavaScript and just writing HTML and just writing CSS, nothing much more. Does this prospect excite you? No, right. So when I do this poll, generally the response rate I get is something between 5 and 10%. Okay, so why is that? The reason is the reasons that I talked to you, that I mentioned before. The reality is that server-side web frameworks have served us well over a long period of time. There's not a whole fundamental discontent with the way these web applications work, even from a user standpoint. So for all those reasons, I don't think we're talking about a wholesale replacement of JavaScript frameworks. I very much doubt if that's going to become a de facto monoculture. What I do think is that we're looking at coexistence, and we've dealt with this coexistence for a long time. If you look at the Java web framework space, we have a bunch of those, and they all have different philosophies. In the end, I think this is just going to be yet another option, yet another tool in your tool belt that you use wisely when you need to. The other possibility I absolutely see